Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They thought they were teaching me a lesson about independence, and they said it with those practiced smiles that looked generous from across a table. But as I sat there and heard my mom announce that it was time for me to move out and make it on my own, with my dad nodding like a manager who loves the sound of his own policy, I felt something click that had nothing to do with pride or rebellion and everything to do with finally seeing the scoreboard, because while they were performing tough love for the family, I was sitting there with a quiet ledger in my head of every bill I had covered so that the house stayed calm and their routine never broke. And I realized I was done letting them pretend I was the one leaning while I was the one actually holding the line. I did not make a scene, because I've learned that a loud reaction only gives everyone else a story to comfort themselves with, so I asked if this was something they had discussed together and decided was best for me. And my mom said it was time I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet, and my dad threw in a speech about adulthood and timelines, and how he moved out young and never looked back, and my brother Jason cracked a joke about how I could finally stop eating their food. And my sister Megan stayed quiet in that careful way she does when she agrees, but wants to look kind, and I nodded like I was grateful for a chance to prove myself while inside I was taking a breath I should have taken years ago. What none of them knew, and what I kept to myself because sometimes silence is the only protection you have while you plan your exit, was that for a long time I had been the one who logged in, checked due dates, covered shortfalls, and made sure nothing got shut off. Not because I wanted a medal, but because I could not stand the constant stress calls about late fees and service warnings, and how everything was out to get them, and it felt simpler to fix the bleeding and move on than to swim through the debates and guilt that always followed, so I did it quietly and regularly, and every month they told themselves a story about how they were helping me, and every month I let them. When they made the announcement in front of the family, it was not the message that bruised me so much as the performance, the part where they framed it as a loving push and painted me as someone who needed a plan, as if I had not been the plan, and I felt the steady, almost boring clarity settle in, the kind that lets you hear the actual words people choose and measure what they think of you without arguing with it, and I decided I would not explain, because explanation is a gift you give to people who want to understand you, and that was clearly not the room I was in. I said I would start packing the next day, and that it was fine, and my mom clapped like I had agreed to a new gym membership, and my dad said he was proud of me for taking it like an adult. And Megan hugged me a little too long like she knew there was more under the surface, and Jason asked if he could have my old desk, and I said sure, because I was done fighting over furniture when the real fight was over respect. And I could buy another desk, but I could not buy back the years I had spent covering for people who still wanted to call me a dependent. That night, I went to my room and I did the only thing that felt like sanity, which was to open my laptop, pull up the accounts that no one ever asked about, and start unwinding the mess that had grown around me. And it was not dramatic or loud or even especially satisfying at first, more like taking a knot out of a chain one link at a time, so I removed my card from the gas account. I turned off autopay on the power and water. I canceled the streaming bundles I had been fronting because it was easier to hear laughter than complaints, and I printed confirmation emails to a folder with my name on it, not because I planned to wave them around, but because I wanted a clean line between what I used to carry and what I would no longer touch. While I clicked through those pages, I thought about all the little bargains I had made with myself, the ones where you say it is only for a month or two, the ones where you tell yourself you are helping the family get through a rough spot, the ones where you look at your savings and think you can make up the difference later, and I could feel the anger folding into something colder and steadier, not revenge for the sake of revenge, but fairness that had been delayed so long it almost felt radical, and I promised myself I would not be mean, I would not shout, I would not try to embarrass them, I would just move my support back to me and let reality do the talking. Before I shut the laptop, I changed one more small thing that no one in the house would notice until they did, which was the contact phone on several accounts that had always pinged my number first, and I put in theirs. Because if you want people to grow up, then you let the ringing reach their own pockets, and as I powered down I felt that steady calm that comes when you finally decide to go with the facts instead of the story. And I set my alarm for the morning and made a list of boxes to fill. And I did not write a single line about being sorry. Tomorrow I will start packing, and tomorrow I will smile and say I am excited, and tomorrow they will still believe I am the student and they are the teachers, which is fine, because by the time the first overdue notice lands where it should have always landed, they will begin to understand the simplest truth I kept under my tongue all evening, and while I am not saying anything yet, I have already made my first move, and the first move is always the one that tips the table just enough to make everyone grab for their plates. I woke up with that steady kind of resolve that feels almost boring until you realize it is the only thing keeping you from sliding back into the same old patterns, and as I started folding my life into boxes, I kept hearing their barbecue voices in my head. The speeches about independence and timelines and how I would thank them later, and I let those lines play like a dull radio while I did something they have never done for me, which was walk through the actual math of the last few years and admit out loud, at least to myself, that the person who needed a push was not the one lugging boxes, because the person who needed a push was the pair who built a story where they were the rescuers while I ran the quiet rescue behind the scenes every single month. As I wrapped plates in old grocery receipts, I found notes to myself for months when the bank account was tight because I had covered the power and the water and the internet after the warning emails started stacking up. And I remembered how I would tell myself it was temporary, that things were just rough for a bit, that once Dad's hours stabilized and Mom stopped picking up random overtime, the house would level out, and how that day never really came. Not because life is impossible, but because it is too easy to normalize help when the help is quiet, and it hit me that I had not only paid bills, I had absorbed their anxiety like a full-time side job. I had answered the late-night calls from Mom about notices and fees. I had watched Dad complain about interest and unfair companies, and I had thought I was keeping peace when I was really keeping a lie alive. The packing went faster than I expected because when you strip a room to what you actually own, you find out how much of your life was spent maintaining other people's comfort instead of building your own. And while I pulled books from a shelf that had mostly been a dumping spot for family paperwork, I found the binder I made during the first winter after Jason wrecked his second used car and Dad needed the insurance downshifted, the binder that held logins, account numbers, due dates, and a sad little budget we never followed because any time I brought it up I was told I was overthinking and that family should not nickel and dime family. And I stood there holding that binder and understood that my silence had been a kind of permission slip they cashed every month. So I did more than pack, because leaving with boxes and a smile would have looked polite but would not have changed the structure that kept me stuck, and I am done being polite at my own expense, which is why, after a long sip of coffee that did not taste like victory so much as oxygen, I called the phone carrier whose app has lived on my home screen for years. The account that I opened back when Megan needed a cheaper plan for school and Jason could not keep a phone turned on for more than half a semester, and I moved my line to a separate account with a single click that asked if I wanted to keep my number and my history, and then I scheduled the remaining lines to end at the close of the billing period, which is generous by any standard, because it gives them a clear window to set up their own plan without a blackout, and it returns the responsibility for verification codes and password resets to the pockets where they actually belong. Then I pulled up my auto insurance portal, the one I had adjusted years ago when Dad asked if I could add Jason for a while because the rate would be better under my policy, and he promised to reimburse me once his job stabilized. And I stared at a renewal that never again matched the promised paybacks, and I removed Jason effective on the day I hand in my key, not to punish him, but to stop underwriting a boy who became a man on paper yet kept his finances parked in my name. And I printed the confirmation not because I plan to wave it like a trophy, but because I know how these conversations go when people are suddenly asked to remember the help they demanded but never acknowledged. While the printer did its slow, stubborn thing, I cleared my saved payment methods from the utility portals I had touched last night, and I switched the email on file to the one Mom actually checks, and I set the notifications to urgent. Not because I want them to panic, but because I am finished being the shock absorber for every avoidable oversight, and as those confirmations landed in my inbox for the last time, I let myself feel the uncomfortable truth that I could have done this a year ago. And chose not to because I was more afraid of being called ungrateful than I was of becoming resentful, which is a terrible trade, and I am not making it again. I slid the binder into a slim folder and wrote 3 lines on a single sheet that I will leave on the kitchen counter when I go. Not a manifesto or a speech, just the plain passwords they need to reset, the dates when services renew, and a sentence that says the accounts are now theirs to manage, and if they want help they will have to use the word please. And I know that sounds petty when you say it fast, but it is actually the minimum standard for respect in any relationship, even a family one, maybe especially a family one, and if they do not like the feeling of being responsible for their own life, they can talk to the version of themselves who gave me a lecture about independence while I refilled their gas card on the drive home. By the time the last box is taped and stacked by the door, my phone will stop being the house switchboard. Jason will get a notification that he needs his own coverage before he borrows Dad's car again. Mom will start receiving the reminders I have been catching for years, and I will finally get to decide where my money goes without also budgeting a household that denies it needs me. And I am not telling them any of this yet because the quiet before a truth arrives is the only silence they ever gave me, so I am taking it, and when they notice what changed and come looking for someone to blame, I will be busy lifting that last box, which is not even the last move. Just the one before the one that will actually make them stop in the driveway and see me clearly for the first time. By the time the day settled into that pre-move limbo where everything is half-packed and nothing feels like it belongs to you anymore, I could hear the first rip in the fabric I had held together for years. Because my phone started buzzing with those familiar little messages that always arrived when the invisible systems I managed hiccuped, and my mom wrote that the television apps were throwing error messages. And a few minutes later my dad asked if the internet password had changed, and it would have taken me 20 seconds to log in, swap a setting, and calm the house like I always did, but I stared at the screen and decided that if they wanted me to grow up then they could meet adulthood on their own devices. So I typed back that I was in the middle of boxes and suggested they check their email for service notices, which is exactly where those notices have been landing since I updated the contact fields. And then I put the phone face down and let the silence do a job I had always done for them. Packing has a way of exposing the unpaid emotional invoices you have been carrying, and while I wrapped framed photos and folded the last of my bedding, I thought about all the nights I had rescued them with a login and a credit card. How I would take a deep breath and fix whatever was broken, because I could not stand the panic in my mom's voice or the grumbling in my dad's, and how that quick fix turned into a role that never expired. And I realized that nothing I was doing today was cruel or dramatic. It was simply handing back a set of responsibilities to the people who own them, and if it felt like a cut, it was only because the wound had been numbed for too long by my willingness to swallow the sting for everyone. The calls kept coming, not angry at first, just confused, with my mom asking if I had seen any emails about the billing cycle and my dad muttering about how companies love to nickel and dime people with late fees. And I kept my voice level and said the same thing each time, that I was in the middle of a move and could not jump on the computer, that everything should be in their email now, that they might want to set up their own passwords while they were at it. And I could hear the resistance. Under the questions, the part of them that wanted the old rhythm where I would sigh and fix it, and when I did not, the confusion shifted toward irritation because people do not like discovering how much work you were doing for them until the work stops. Between those calls I finished the kind of housekeeping I had always postponed because it felt like admitting something about the relationship that I did not want to admit, so I forwarded my mail. Closed out the last shared subscriptions that had always been a so-called family perk but always charged to me, exported a year of bank statements into a folder I named with the date, so I would never again be drawn into a debate about what was covered and when. And I filed the confirmations from the phone plan and the insurance change in a neat stack with the lease for my new place, a little pile of paper that said, without any speech, that my life was no longer built on keeping other adults comfortable at my expense. When Mom called again to say the internet provider would not speak to her because the passcode did not match and she wanted to know if I could just give it to her for a minute, I told her calmly that the company would help her set up her own access once she verified as the resident, and I added, as gently as I could manage, that this was the independence they wanted for me and it worked both ways. And there was a pause where she did not know whether to thank me or blame me, and I filled that paused by saying I had left a simple sheet on the counter with dates and contact numbers, and that I would be out of the house soon, which is the plainest truth I have spoken to her in a long time. The first cut was not the streaming services or the phone lines or even the overdue notices that would finally land in the right inbox. The first cut was me refusing to be the quiet emergency plan, because once I stopped absorbing the shock, the impact finally reached the people who had been shielded from it, and that alone changed the entire conversation. And if you were looking for a moment that felt like revenge, it was not loud or flashy. It was me calling the utility companies to remove the paperless setting I had enabled and to confirm that final statements and any security deposit refunds tied to my name would be mailed to my new address, which means the next envelopes they open will not be warnings they can forward to me with a sigh, but real bills with their own names on them, along with a missing deposit they will have to replace on their own. And while that might sound small from the outside, it is the cleanest cut I could make without drawing blood. I know this all sounds meticulous and maybe a little cold, and I can hear someone in the back of the room saying I should have sat them down and explained every step. But explanations have been my currency for years, and they were always spent to buy a few more months of denial. So instead, I am letting the facts arrive like clockwork, and I am keeping my focus on the move. And when my dad finally texted that he had spent an hour on hold and still could not get a person to fix the internet, I told him I believed he could handle it, and that I trusted him to set it up the way he liked, which earned me a 4-word reply that basically said I was being difficult, and I put the phone back down and taped the next box, because tomorrow is moving day. And when I lift that last box and they ask me where everything stands, I will hand them the truth in one sentence that will land harder than any argument I could have staged tonight. Moving day always looks like logistics from the outside, boxes and tape and cars in the driveway, but what it really is, at least for me, is a test of whether you will keep acting like the old version of yourself when people press the same buttons they have always pressed. And by the time I carried the last box to the trunk, my mom had asked me twice if we could talk about the internet, and my dad had circled the topic with those managerial phrases about transitions and responsibilities, and I could feel the tug toward that familiar role where I say, do not worry, I will handle it. So I took a breath, closed the trunk, and said in a voice that was steady enough to surprise even me that I had already handled it, just not in the way they expected. Because I stopped paying their bills months ago and moved every notification to their own email, and if the house still felt smooth, it was only because the billing cycles were coasting on what I had already covered while I packed and planned. 2. Leave. You would think that sentence would detonate the conversation, but at first there was only confusion, the kind that makes people repeat your words back to you like they will change on the second pass. With my mom asking what I meant by stopped and whether I was saying I would not help this month or at all, and my dad asking if I had at least left the accounts accessible so he could get a person on the phone and fix whatever some system messed up. And I told them I had done something fair and overdue, which was return the responsibility to the people who insisted on giving speeches about independence, and that meant I had removed my cards, turned off autopays, switched contact numbers, and left a simple one-page sheet on the kitchen counter with reset instructions and dates, because adults who want to be in charge should also be in charge of passwords, bills, and hold music. Jason tried to make a joke about how the house would go dark like a sitcom, and Megan gave me that look that says she knows more than she is willing to say out loud. And I stayed with the facts because facts are hard to argue with when everyone is standing next to a car full of boxes, so I laid it out without heat, explaining that I had covered the utilities for longer than I care to admit, that I had handled the family phone plan long past the point where it was helpful, that I had carried the streaming bundles and the gas card and even the insurance for a while because it was always just for a bit, and that as of today my support stopped not out of spite but out of sanity, and if they wanted to call it tough love, they could finally apply the phrase to themselves. My dad said it would have been nice to get a heads up, which is funny in a tired way when you remember a BBQ announcement that publicly handed me a deadline in the name of growth. And I told him the heads up had arrived in his own inbox the moment I changed the contact fields, and that there would be no cliff this week because I had scheduled everything to end at the close of their current cycles, which gives them time to set up their own accounts without a blackout, but that I would not be the emergency plan anymore, and the way his face shifted from irritated to calculating told me he was already running through his favorite routes to get me back to the keyboard, the ones that rely on guilt, urgency, or the idea that I am better at this and should therefore keep doing it. So I cut off those routes with one more sentence that I practiced in my head all morning because I knew I would need it, and I said that I am done performing gratitude for being kept under the same roof while I finance the roof. And I do not owe anyone a gentle handoff when the same people staged a lesson at a barbecue, and if they want to be proud of me for acting like an adult, they can start by acting like adults themselves by opening their laptop and calling their providers. And if they want help, they can ask for it with the same respect they demand, not with lectures disguised as love, and not with the assumption that I will cave, because I hate conflict more than I hate being used. My mom's voice went small the way it does when she feels cornered, and she said she would have paid if she had known, which is a sentence that lands like sincerity until you remember how many times I offered to walk through a budget and was told not to make things complicated. And I told her I believed she meant it, and that believing it did not change the fact that I had carried them for years, and that the truth is not a punishment even if it feels like one when it arrives at the wrong time. And I watched her look past me toward the front door like the house itself might answer for her, which it cannot, not anymore. There is a quiet that comes after a boundary finally stands up, and you can feel everyone testing it with their eyes, trying to find a hinge to pry, and I let that quiet stretch, because I wanted them to hear the weight of what I was not going to do. And then I said I was heading out and that the keys were on the hook by the pantry, and that the one page on the counter would get them through the next week if they actually read it, and that I would pick up any mail addressed to me at my new place. Once the forwarding started, and my dad said this felt extreme, and I told him it only felt extreme because for years I kept the temperature low, and I am not the thermostat anymore. I got in the car while they stood there fighting the urge to demand and the fear of sounding ungrateful, and before I pulled away I rolled down the window and gave them the cleanest version of the truth I could manage, that I loved them, that I would not keep rescuing them, and that the next part would be up to them. And I almost left it there, but I am not done, not yet, because there is one last detail that will force a level of ownership no speech ever has, and I am saving it for the moment. When they finally call to ask what exactly they have to do to keep the house running without me. Driving away from that house should have felt like the end of something heavy, the kind of relief you imagine when you finally put down a load you have been carrying too long, but instead it felt more like the pause between one move and the next. Because even though the trunk was packed and the passenger seat was stacked with the little things I never trusted anyone else to carry, I knew there was still one piece of unfinished business that would decide whether this story ended with me just moving out or with me actually walking away free, and that piece sat quietly in the back of my mind as I watched my parents shrink smaller in the rearview mirror, still standing in the driveway trying to convince themselves they had done the right thing by pushing me out while avoiding the fact that the ground they were standing on had been financed by the daughter they just dismissed. The truth about those accounts, the ones that kept the water flowing and the lights on and the phones active, is that they had always been mine, not just in the sense that I had paid for them, but literally mine, opened in my name, managed under my credit, tied to my cards, and protected by my passwords, because when the family needed help years ago, it was faster to use my stability than to battle through their late fees and bad history, and at the time I told myself it was temporary, just a bridge until things evened out, but bridges have a way of becoming permanent roads when no one else bothers to build their own, and I realized on moving day that if I simply walked away without closing that loop, I would still be tied to them, still be carrying a part of the weight they refused to acknowledge. So before I even unpacked a single box at the new apartment, I sat down with my laptop and pulled up every account one by one, confirming that my card was gone, confirming that my email was replaced with theirs, confirming that every autopay was canceled. And then I took the step that I had saved for last, the one that would force them to build their own structure instead of quietly writing mine, and I requested that each account be closed at the end of the cycle because the owner of record, me, was no longer residing at that address, which meant they would have no choice but to reopen under their own names, their own credit scores, their own responsibility, and for the first time in years, their own consequences. The weight of that decision settled differently than I expected. It did not feel spiteful or cruel or even particularly triumphant. It felt like clicking a lock into place after years of leaving the door cracked open, because I was not punishing them. I was simply giving back what they had pretended to carry, and the fact that it would sting when the lights flickered or the internet cut out was not because I had pulled anything away, but because they had never built the habit of standing on their own legs, and now they finally had to. When my dad called later that evening, his voice edged with the kind of irritation that usually preceded a lecture, and asked if I knew why the power company had said there was no active account at the house anymore. I told him plainly that it was because the account had always been mine and I had closed it, and that if they wanted the lights on they would need to open a new one under their own names, and the silence that followed was longer than anything I had heard from him before. Because in that single moment he realized not only that they had been leaning on me, but that they had been leaning on me legally, financially, structurally, in every way that mattered, and that the story they told themselves about raising me had been upside down for years. Mom tried to step in with a softer voice, asking if I could leave things just a little longer until they sorted it out, and I told her I had already left them longer than I ever should have, that I had carried them past the point where it was healthy for any of us, and that the best thing I could do for myself, and honestly the best thing I could do for them, was to hand back their life in its entirety, not just in pieces, because if I left even one thread attached, they would pull on it until I was woven back into the same old net. I think what shocked them most was not that I had stopped paying, but that I had been the one holding the reins all along. That the independence they preached to me at a barbecue was something I had already mastered while they lived in a comfort funded by my quiet sacrifice, and when I ended the call, I did not feel guilt. I felt something closer to balance. Like the scale that had been tilted for so long finally leveled, and whether they admitted it or not, they knew the truth had caught up. As I unpacked that night in a small place that actually belonged to me, surrounded by boxes that only held my things and not the weight of everyone else's obligations, I realized that the last box I carried out of that house was not the cardboard one in my trunk, but the invisible one filled with responsibility I had never signed up for, and by closing those accounts and walking away, I finally set that box down and left it where it belonged, on their doorstep, where it should have always stayed. I know there will be fallout. I know there will be calls and complaints and stories told to relatives about how ungrateful I was, but none of that changes the fact that I walked away lighter, freer, and clearer than I have ever been. And as I sat in the quiet of my own apartment that first night, I told myself that if the price of being seen as ungrateful is finally being respected as an adult, then I will pay it gladly, because I did not just move out of a house. I moved out of a role I never should have been playing, and for the first time in years, I get to decide what I carry and what I put down, and I will never again let anyone confuse my silence with consent.